He believed this neighborhood was absolutely perfect, a place where pristine lawns and orderly sidewalks created the illusion of harmony. But Chuck Norris noticed cracks in the veneer from the moment he arrived for a brief visit with an old friend who had recently moved to this seemingly idyllic community. The tree-lined streets glimmered under a late afternoon sun, children played joyously in neat cul-de-sacs, and neighbors exchanged polite waves whenever a car rolled by. Yet Chuck felt an underlying tension, an unease that made him scan every detail with quiet vigilance. He was staying with his friend Arthur, who had boasted endlessly about the homeowners association that kept the area immaculate, guaranteeing high property values and a sense of exclusivity. Chuck listened politely, though he never placed too much trust in appearances alone. One morning, he went for a walk around the neighborhood, enjoying a mild breeze and the whisper of leaves in the trees, but that was when he noticed something off near the park in the subdivision's center. There was a towering retaining wall that loomed over the playground, meant to keep the soil and landscaping from spilling into the space where kids laughed and clambered up jungle gyms. Chuck paused, eyes narrowing as he approached the wall, reading the subtle lines of stress that spiderwebbed through the concrete. He pressed a hand against one section, feeling a faint tremor beneath his fingertips. Chunks of mortar had flaked off the lower portions, exposing rebar that looked rusty under closer inspection. He scanned the perimeter, realizing that if part of the wall were to collapse, it would send a cascade of earth and debris right where children loved to gather. Chuck felt a chill coil in his gut, because he knew how easily a seemingly sturdy structure could fail if left unrepaired, so he knelt down, brushing away loose gravel. That simple motion revealed a small gap between the base of the wall and the concrete foundation, big enough to slip a finger through. It spoke of water damage that had gradually eroded the integrity of the retaining structure. He straightened, scanning the playground where several small children giggled on a slide, unaware of the potential disaster overhead. Chuck's jaw set with determination, because he couldn't ignore what his instincts were telling him. His first action was to locate a groundskeeper or someone from the HOA who might be on duty, but he found none. Instead, he overheard two local residents conversing near a wooden bench, complaining about how they had reported that wall's deterioration multiple times, only to be brushed off by the Homeowners Association board, which insisted it was too expensive to fix or claimed an engineering inspection had labeled it as stable enough. The residents sounded resigned, making frustrated gestures that hinted they knew no real solution was coming anytime soon. Chuck introduced himself politely, asking if they would mind sharing what they knew. One of them, a woman named Letitia, explained that the HOA had been presented with pictures showing cracks and water seepage, but they dismissed them as minor cosmetic issues. The other, a man named Byron, nodded, telling Chuck that during the rainy season the wall leaked muddy water onto the playground wood chips, causing a slippery mess that stained kids' clothes. Byron had tried to speak at an HOA meeting about it, but he was given a dismissive response, with some members pointing out that the cost to rebuild or reinforce the retaining wall could lead to higher monthly dues, which most neighbors did not want. Chuck listened quietly, feeling his temper smolder, but he forced himself to remain calm. He thanked them for the information, then returned to Arthur's house. Over dinner that night, Chuck brought up the retaining wall, telling Arthur he was concerned about what he saw, so Arthur shrugged, explaining that the HOA had always been tight with money, focusing on superficial beautification like flower beds at the entrance instead of major structural issues. Chuck frowned, pointing out the inherent danger if that wall collapsed, but Arthur said most people in the neighborhood thought the risk was low, or they assumed someone else would handle it eventually. This apathy unsettled Chuck, so he decided to investigate further. Early the next morning, Chuck returned to the park with a camera in hand. He snapped pictures of the cracks, the exposed rebar, and the sagging sections of the retaining wall, then walked along its entire length, noticing some portions were patched with what looked like cheap mortar that had started chipping away. He took note of water stains that ran vertically from the top to the middle, concluding that drainage behind the wall was likely poor. If the region experienced even one heavy storm, the added weight of saturated soil could trigger a catastrophic failure. He found a small opening in a gate that led to an uphill portion of the neighborhood, climbing gently sloped paths and circling behind the retaining wall. From there, he discovered that the upper landscaping included sprinkler lines that must have been leaking for some time, because the ground felt marshy despite the dry climate. That meant water was constantly seeping behind the wall, weakening it day by day. Chuck carefully documented each piece of evidence, mindful of how crucial it might be to convince an HOA board that had repeatedly ignored resident complaints. On his way back, he crossed paths with a cheerful mother walking two young children, both bouncing in excitement at the mention of going to the playground. Chuck greeted them, noticing the kids carried plastic shovels and small pails, probably eager to dig in the sandbox. He forced a smile, but he felt an urgent need to protect them from dangers they didn't even suspect. At Arthur's home, Chuck compiled his photos and notes into a neat folder, attaching observations about the potential for a landslide if the wall gave way. He included references to basic structural integrity guidelines, explaining that the visible rebar corrosion and significant cracks were not superficial. Once done, he asked Arthur for the contact details of the HOA board, discovering that the president was a man named Peter Burnside, known for being stubborn and thrifty to a fault. Arthur provided an email address and phone number, warning Chuck that Burnside was not known for quick or cooperative responses. Chuck called anyway, leaving a polite but firm voicemail that requested a meeting to discuss urgent safety concerns. He followed up with an email, attaching images of the damaged wall. The day dragged on without a reply. By evening, Chuck decided to appear in person at the HOA office, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that looked more like a storage shed than an administrative hub. A single window overlooked a manicured lawn dotted with pink geraniums. Chuck knocked on the door, hearing rustling inside, but the door remained closed. When he knocked again, the door finally creaked open, revealing a short, bespectacled man with thinning hair, who introduced himself as Randall, an HOA clerk. Chuck introduced himself politely, explaining he had urgent safety matters to discuss. Randall looked uneasy, admitting that the board was in the middle of a closed meeting. Chuck offered to wait until they finished, so Randall led him to a cramped foyer and told him to sit on a folding chair. After a half hour, the door to the boardroom swung open, revealing a handful of individuals who regarded Chuck with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. One man with a stately posture and a severe expression approached, introducing himself as Burnside, the HOA president. Chuck repeated his concerns about the retaining wall, describing in detail the cracks, seepage, and potential collapse scenario, handing over the folder of photographs and notes. Burnside accepted it with a polite nod, flipping through the images, but Chuck noticed the man's face remained impassive, as if unimpressed. Burnside sighed, explaining that the HOA had a budget to maintain landscaping, security patrols, and community events, but major structural repairs like rebuilding a retaining wall would require a special assessment that most homeowners would resist, especially because they had just completed an expensive pool renovation. Chuck's tone hardened as he asked if Burnside truly believed cost concerns outweighed the safety of children. The other board members hovered nearby, avoiding eye contact. Burnside claimed the board had hired an inspector months ago who concluded the wall was aging but not at immediate risk. Chuck pointed out that water infiltration might have accelerated the damage since that inspection, urging them to consult a second expert opinion. A flicker of annoyance crossed Burnside's face. He restated that the HOA would take the matter under advisement, ending with a tight-lipped smile that told Chuck he was being dismissed. Chuck refused to budge, so Burnside abruptly said they had another meeting to attend, stepping back and effectively shutting the door on him. The message was clear. They saw Chuck as an outsider meddling in finances and priorities that did not concern him. Chuck left, but not before telling Burnside through the half-closed door that ignoring a ticking time bomb would not end well for anyone. Outside, Chuck took a calming breath, scanning the immaculate gardens, the decorative stone fountain, and the neat rows of homes. The entire place reeked of curated perfection, but behind the facade lingered negligence that could put lives at stake. Over the next few days, Chuck spoke with other residents who revealed more stories of the HOA's apathy. A father recounted how he had nearly been hit by a piece of loose concrete that had fallen from the top of the wall after a mild tremor. A teenager described how she and her friends heard ominous creaking noises while standing near the base. Several parents had signed letters demanding immediate repairs, but they kept getting the runaround from the board. Chuck's frustration grew with each testimony, so he decided to gather everyone who cared about the issue in one place. He arranged a meeting at Arthur's house, inviting neighbors who had concerns about the wall, encouraging them to bring photos or written complaints. That evening, the living room filled with worried people who felt ignored and powerless. They wanted a safe community, but the HOA had stonewalled them at every turn. Chuck reminded them that if they joined forces, they could push for real change. He suggested they submit a formal petition to the board, calling for an urgent engineering survey. They compiled all their evidence, from Chuck's notes to personal accounts. Some had pictures of fallen debris, others had logs of calls made to the HOA that went unreturned. Chuck took each piece of information and organized it into a single binder, including contact details for a reputable civil engineer he had worked with in the past during a volunteer project. The neighbors agreed to sign an official petition, drafting language that demanded immediate action to avert a potentially tragic accident. Before the night was over, Chuck had dozens of signatures. With the petition in hand, Chuck called Burnside again, leaving a message that they now had enough support to force an emergency meeting. The next day, Chuck arrived at the HOA office with the binder, accompanied by Letitia and Byron, along with half a dozen other residents. They waited in the foyer until Burnside and 2 other board members emerged. Burnside looked uneasy at the sight of so many concerned neighbors. Chuck handed him the petition, emphasizing they had more than enough signatures to trigger an official response per the HOA's own bylaws. Burnside reluctantly invited them into a small meeting room, which was barely large enough for the group, telling them they had limited time. Letitia and Byron spoke passionately about their fears, reminding the board that a collapse would not only endanger children, but also create massive liability and potential lawsuits. Chuck added that his engineering contact could come that same week to perform a thorough inspection. Burnside thumbed through the petition and binder, his face clouding with frustration. He knew ignoring it would violate the HOA's governing documents, potentially removing him from his position. A tense silence followed, finally broken when Burnside agreed to discuss the matter with the full board at an emergency session. The neighbors were told they would be informed of any decision within a few days. Chuck, suspicious of foot-dragging tactics, made sure he had copies of everything they had given Burnside, refusing to let the original documents out of his sight. After the confrontation, Chuck walked around the neighborhood with a keen eye, noticing that a storm was forecast for the weekend. If heavy rainfall drenched the soil behind the wall, it might be too late to prevent a disaster. He updated the neighbors, advising them to keep their children away from the playground until further notice. Some families began to worry about Halloween events that were planned in the park the following week, but Chuck assured them that the most important thing was to stay safe. That very night, the skies darkened, thunder rumbled in the distance, and a sudden downpour pummeled the area. Chuck watched from Arthur's window as torrents of rain sheeted across the streets, pooling along curbs and grassy lawns. He imagined the water saturating the soil behind the weakened retaining wall. Unease gnawed at him, so he stepped outside under an umbrella, wanting to see if any portion of the wall was showing signs of distress. As soon as he reached the park, Chuck found a small crowd gathered near the edge of the playground, shining flashlights on sections of the concrete. Byron was among them, pointing to a diagonal crack that had widened since the previous day. Muddy water trickled from behind the wall, seeping through gaps that had grown visibly larger. The wall groaned ominously, a low vibration that rippled beneath their feet. Chuck ordered everyone to step back, because the ground at the base felt spongy and unstable. They retreated to the far side of the park, straining to see the wall through the rain-blurred darkness. In a moment of tense anticipation, the cracking sound intensified, and a sizable chunk of concrete broke away, clattering down in a shower of debris. Thankfully, no one was nearby, but it was a clear warning that more could collapse. Chuck radioed for the local fire department, urging them to come assess the danger, and within minutes, red and blue lights flashed against the drenched night sky. Firefighters arrived, shining spotlights onto the deteriorating wall, The captain quickly cordoned off the playground, telling bystanders to clear the area. Chuck helped direct folks away, guiding them towards safer ground. The rain refused to let up, hammering the soil behind that wall, threatening to unleash a landslide at any moment. One of the firefighters muttered that he had never seen such a precarious situation in a planned community, and Chuck only shook his head, thinking about how easily this could have been avoided if the HOA had taken timely action. Eventually, the storm subsided, leaving behind deep puddles and a battered retaining wall that looked on the verge of total failure. The firefighters recommended evacuating the adjacent homes on the upper slope until an engineer could evaluate stability. That announcement sent panic through those who lived close to the top of the hill, who hurried to gather their valuables in case the hillside gave way. Chuck spoke with the fire captain, offering details about the water infiltration he had seen, and the captain nodded gravely, explaining that they would contact city officials for an urgent inspection at first light. By dawn, local media caught wind of the drama, and a news van arrived to interview witnesses. Letitia and Byron were among those who gave on-camera statements, telling reporters about how residents had warned the HOA repeatedly. Chuck stepped back, not wanting the spotlight, but the reporter recognized him, pressing him for comments. He calmly stated that this entire crisis could have been prevented if the board had acted responsibly. Meanwhile, Burnside and his fellow board members arrived on the scene, looking flustered. They attempted to deflect blame, but the reporter pressed them about the petition and the evidence of prior complaints. Burnside fumbled his words, stammering that they had planned to address the issue, but the storm simply arrived at an unfortunate time. Chuck fixed him with a level gaze that made Burnside squirm. Soon after, a structural engineer arrived with a city inspector. They examined the wall, climbing onto the saturated slope above and taking careful measurements of the cracks. Chuck trailed behind them at a respectful distance, overhearing the engineer mutter that the entire structure was compromised. If it shifted more, large sections of earth could tumble down, jeopardizing not only the playground but also the lower portion of the housing tract. The inspector confronted Burnside, asking why the HOA had not scheduled repairs earlier. Burnside tried to argue finances, then pivoted to claiming he was misinformed about the severity. The inspector was not impressed, pointing out that the cracks were glaringly obvious and that delaying action had put lives at risk. With the city now involved, the HOA no longer had the option to ignore the problem. City officials declared the wall a public hazard, ordering an immediate closure of the park and the sidewalk near it, while demanding an urgent construction plan. Neighbors who had previously been brushed aside felt a sense of grim validation, though they also worried about the cost. Chuck spoke with some residents, reminding them that finances meant nothing compared to a child's life. They agreed, willing to pay any necessary assessment if it meant preventing a disaster. Construction crews arrived within days, erecting temporary supports and tearing down the most unstable segments of the retaining wall. Heavy machinery rumbled across the once serene park, digging drainage trenches and reinforcing the hillside with steel beams. The playground remained fenced off, silent except for the rumble of excavators. The neighborhood's families watched from behind barricades, grateful that the worst outcome had been averted, yet lamenting that it had come so close to tragedy. Burnside called an emergency HOA meeting in the local community center, hoping to salvage his reputation, but many residents expressed anger about the negligence. Chuck attended, standing in the back as neighbors lambasted the board for ignoring warnings and overshadowing real hazards with cosmetic expenditures. Burnside tried to smooth over tensions, claiming they would establish a new emergency fund and reevaluate priorities. Chuck observed quietly, feeling the tension thick in the air. One resident demanded Burnside step down, and others shouted in agreement. Burnside refused to resign, but a recall petition began circulating immediately after the meeting. Chuck watched the scene with calm detachment, content to let the residents take charge of holding their leaders accountable. Over the following weeks, a radical transformation unfolded. New board members were elected, residents volunteered to help with neighborhood safety audits, and local contractors worked overtime to rebuild and strengthen the entire length of the retaining wall. Chuck lent his voice of experience, suggesting better drainage systems and improved soil compaction. He spent hours consulting with the new board on possible ways to prevent future structural failures, recommending routine inspections and maintenance schedules. By the time the heavy machinery rumbled away and the final barricades came down, the park reopened with a brand new retaining wall, complete with professionally installed drainage channels. The playground was cleared of debris, receiving new wood chips and a fresh coat of paint on the swing sets. Children returned, playing as if no shadow had loomed over their safety mere weeks before. Neighbors gathered in small celebration, bringing potluck dishes to the newly fortified park, grateful that a near disaster had been averted, while acknowledging that it had taken a jolt of fear to spark real accountability. Burnside, under enormous pressure, resigned his position, which relieved many who believed his inaction had nearly cost them dearly. Chuck, meanwhile, quietly prepared to move on. He had not come to this neighborhood seeking conflict, but he could never stand by if people were endangered, especially children. On his last evening in town, as the sun dipped behind the row of newly safe homes, Arthur thanked Chuck, admitting that without his intervention, the retaining wall might have collapsed the night of the storm. Chuck shrugged, saying it was a matter of doing what needed to be done. Letitia and Byron dropped by to say farewell, expressing gratitude on behalf of dozens of residents who felt their voices were finally heard. Chuck nodded, reminding them that vigilance was the price of a safe community, urging them to keep pushing for accountability and to never let complacency take root again. The next morning, Chuck packed his duffel bag into his truck, glancing one last time at the perfectly trimmed lawns and newly rebuilt wall in the distance. The threat had been neutralized, but the lesson remained. Appearances could be deceiving, and it sometimes took determined effort to protect what really mattered. He drove out of that immaculate subdivision, reflecting on how close they had come to seeing the bright playground buried under a mass of crumbling concrete and soil. Yet the neighborhood emerged stronger, with real unity instead of the superficial polish that once masked negligence. He knew the residents would keep an eye on that wall and any other potential hazards, now that they had learned the cost of ignoring warnings. Road after road disappeared behind him as he followed the highway into open country, the horizon wide before him, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Trouble had a way of finding Chuck Norris, but he never shied away from taking a stand when others' safety was on the line. He kept driving, letting the wind ruffle his hair through the open window, ready for whatever crisis might come next. Watch the next Chuck Norris stories on our channel, because his adventures never end and neither does his resolve to confront danger head-on wherever it appears.